Welcome to the Asian Bankers Association's webinar on the need for advanced analytics for MULE detection. I am honored to serve as your moderator today for today's session. In collaboration with our esteemed associate member BioCatch, we have organized this event to address critical issues faced by banking industry. Obviously, the detection and prevention of fraudulent activities related to money mules. Our distinguished speaker for today is Mr. Edgar Zayas, the Global Director and for Advisory at BioCatch. Edgar is not a new face for us, so he is a high-tech crime investigator with over 15 years of experience in specializing in digital forensics and e-discovery financial crimes and digital fraud detection and preventions. Edgar is currently the Director Global Advisory, devising creative anti-fraud strategies, identifying innovative applications for fraud technology, and working closely with organizations to prevent by implementing the latest in behavior biometrics technologies. I encourage all of you to actively participate in this very informative session, and let us collectively enhance our understanding and strengthen our defenses against the financial crimes. We will take all of your questions at the end of the presentation, and I would like to now hand it over to Edgar to take it from this point onwards. Edgar, over to you.
As 2024 has launched, we've seen that the topic of mules has become a really important subject in the APAC region. From Australia to India, Indonesia, Singapore, we've seen a lot of activity when it comes to this topic. So we thought that it would be good to talk about how advanced analytics can help with investigating and finding and preventing mules, as opposed to the traditional methods that we do with transactions and other AML type of programs to spot mule accounts. I'm gonna share my deck. Give me 1 second. All right, so if we get started here, mules in the media. We've seen from the end of last year, leading up to the beginning of this year, several articles of big busts when it comes to syndicates that are money laundering. We had one in Hong Kong where it was $1.8 billion that was linked to scam cases that were from India. So we had a lot of money being stolen from Indian citizens and it flowing into Singapore. Then we've seen in Singapore as well at the end of last year a big, massive money laundering probe at $2 billion there. And again, a lot of forgery, money laundering from scams. And again, it's scams and fraud and a little bit of online gambling going on in there as well, being funneled through there. In India, we would see smaller cases coming out of there, but again, that it started creating that question with us is, if we see something like six people getting arrested and opening up 126 mule bank accounts, how big is that problem? So we need to dive into that problem because 6 people being able to open that many accounts is a little bit of a concern there. Online tasks, again, and then we saw another case where 14 arrested acting as money mules. And in this situation, what we were seeing is that they were paying victims, they were recruiting victims to, basically they were a scam victim. They were being recruited into doing money laundering, and they believed that what they were doing wasn't money laundering or more of a job type situation. So all these articles brought up that question, okay, how do we look at money laundering? How do we look at mules and how can we jump on them? When we look at the ecosystem of fraud and scams, there's one thing that every single one has in common, and it's that everybody needs a mule account. No matter what's happening, you need a mule account. So that actually starts, when we start thinking about how do we fight fraud and scams, maybe the new approach that we should be looking at is not so much as looking at every single fraud and scam MO and trying to figure out, how do I combat this? But maybe going after the mule account, because at the end of the day, if we tie them up, if they don't have a way of moving that money, then they won't have a chance to execute whatever creative fraud they can come up with. So if we take a look at the AML pyramid of how money laundering looks like, at the top, we got the worst of the worst. And that's what we were seeing in those articles where the 1.8 and the $2 billion were happening. You've got companies that are set up and run by people that are facing publicly, and they are the top of the pyramid. They are the ones that are converting, doing large payouts, moving the money into these syndicates. They are the worst of the worst. But right below them, they need some people to start recruiting and managing these money mules that are all over the place. So you got this mid-tier level that is actively recruiting your money mules. So these are genuine, genuine people, or people that are in call center type operations where all they do is they come to work and they start opening up a mule accounts with either stolen identity, so identity takeover, or they'll do what's called the synthetic identities, where they'll make a combination of real people's data with some fake stuff, and then they come up with a whole new identity, and that will get through the bank's KYC. So it is this bottom layer that we want to focus on. It's how do we pick up that this person has either opened an account under their name or somebody else's name, and they're actively operating them. So to understand this, the complexity of money mules, we at BioCatch, what we started noticing is that there's different personas. We started grouping, depending on what the person is doing, we started grouping them under personas, because at the end of the day, what we do is analyze the behavior of these people. We want to know how they behave, and that way, by the way they behave, is how we start catching and preventing these accounts for operationalizing. So if we go from left to right, the most complicit, the one that's just, wrong all around, is what we call the deceiver. This is the person that just opens up an account to do fraud, and that's usually account takeover and identity takeover, synthetic accounts. And we see a lot of that happening in the US, the UK, Australia. A lot of that happens there. Then we move into this middle bit, though, where it's where we have the peddler and the accomplice, which are pretty similar. But the peddler is actually a person that he knows, or he or she knows, that they're selling their account for bad purposes. They want some money, and they're just going to sell it. They know people, or they found online where they can sell their account to make a quick buck. And then the accomplice is somebody that's willing. They know they're, again, chasing that easy money, and they've made a deal with somebody to do these things. Then you got the deceived, though, which is the interesting one, because it blurs the line between the accomplice and the deceived, which is you have people that are recruited into something that they believe might be legit. They know that it's not quite there. It sounds fishy, but you know what? They're going to go through it. Some of the cases in some countries, like in Australia, the deceived might end up being somebody that's involved, let's say, in a romance scam, and they receive a huge amount of money thinking that somebody's going to move with them and buy a house and a down payment. And when reality is this, they're just money laundering. And then you got the pure victim, which is in some cases people that have installed a bad app, and somebody does account takeover, and now they're using their account for money laundering. Or they, again, it's in the case of scams, somebody that gave control of an account thinking they were doing it for one reason and ends up being something else. So when it comes to the APAC region, and a lot of the mules that we're looking at lately, originating from India, we see that the peddler and the accomplice is a high amount of them is what happens in India, but we also see in other countries, like in Singapore, where you have the accomplice or the deceived, and they end up giving up control of their SingPass accounts, and then becomes a combination of things. Now you have somebody that's the deceiver taking control of that SingPass account and opening up new accounts under that person's name, doing identity takeover, that person not knowing or realizing that this is happening. So a lot of complexities when it comes around understanding who's doing what, but understanding that behavior and understanding that not all the mules are the same is what helps us start doing those analytics. If we look at the problem, there's two ways of attacking it. We can either go with account opening or take a look at the existing accounts. Now, with the example that I was giving earlier of what's happening mostly in the Asia Pacific region, is especially in Southeast Asia, is it's real people opening the account. So trying to catch this at account opening is slightly pointless, because it is a real person and opening it, and in some cases they're opening it at a branch. So even at origination, there's just no way of of seeing any different behavior that's going on there. Now, where we can always see something to do and do something about it is with existing accounts. So when that account starts being used from day one, we can take a look at that account and see how it's behaving, and do some analytics on that. Are they behaving like a regular customer within that population? Are they have they deviated from their behavior in a certain period of time? So if they've been a customer for, for 2 years, and all of a sudden now they're behaving a little bit different. So we believe that in the area of existing accounts is where we can start looking at doing some analysis and trying to pick these or these different personas, the earlier the better. And so what we ended up doing was doing a little bit of an exercise with a bank. And what we did is we did an analysis of some basic numbers, which was to highlight the problem, which was, all right, so the bank had about 225,000 new users in a month registering for online banking. And then we take a look at what happens at that first session, what happens at that first time they log in. And we realized that they were coming from their country of origin. So 98.8%. No VPNs, it's coming from that country. So we can tell that it's not something that's being spoofed. So we have 225,000 accounts getting open, and we also have the millions of customers that we already have. So how are we going to start keeping track of all this? So we started doing a little bit of an exercise and analyzing the actual MULE accounts that we know were MULE accounts, and they had confirmed transactions. So we did an analysis of a sample of 1,038 confirmed transactions. When we looked at those, those transactions were associated with 804 accounts. So now when we start diving into that a little bit deeper, then those transactions were done by 209 unique devices only. So if we look at the ratio of those numbers, they look a little bit off, because if we again go back to what should be normal, you should see about a ratio of 1 to 1, at least. Maybe one person uses one device for their banking, but in reality, we can see even more. So it's one person, and personally, I would have my phone, a tablet, and maybe a laptop. So I would have 3 devices. But when we're looking at these transactions, though, it's a lot different. We have 209 devices doing 1,000 transactions. So then we obviously are, seeing that there's a problem here. So let's start digging in a little bit deeper then. So how many accounts in total did those 209 devices access? So they obviously we know that they access 804, but did they access more that we don't know about? And the answer was yes, a lot more. So 7,400 accounts had been accessed by those 209 devices. So not normal at all. Then how many devices access the 804 accounts? If we start looking at those and start, doing the math a little bit backwards, and now we end up with 6,348 devices. So that's a lot of devices. That's a lot of accounts. And we could probably keep doing this exercise, and that starts compounding. So the confirmed 209 bad devices access those 7,400 accounts. These accounts then were accessed by another 7,172 devices. So we start seeing again that it starts compounding. So how many accounts did the 7,172 devices access? If we keep doing this back and forth exercise, now we're at 22,600 accounts. So these are 22,600 accounts that are associated with devices that we knew the source were devices that were used for money muling. So that's a pretty significant number. Now, that said, there may be devices in there, again, that might be legit. So giving the example of myself and using 3 devices, if I fell to a scam, a Roman scam, I potentially am adding 3 devices to that count. So there's going to be some error in here. So we need to get to the bottom of, well, what's good and what's bad. To keep looking at the data, then we took a look at who was the worst of these devices. And the worst of the devices was one sole device that had access to over 1,600 accounts, and it had done it all on VPNs. So big basic signals right there. And then we see a breakdown of per month of how many accounts they were getting into. That's a quite significant amount per month that they were getting into until November, December, when it died a bit down, and then the account was shut down. If we take a different device, we had one device that had 224 user accounts that they had access. And we do an exercise with linkage, and we start linking the device and the accounts that they were accessing. We start seeing some pretty significant network patterns here. And I think it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but there are some red lines in this mix. And those red lines pretty much signify it's those bad transactions that we had analyzed. So we can see how there's a linkage of a device to another user account. We can see how one user account then has a whole bunch of other devices linked off of, links off to a whole bunch of other user accounts that are linked off to a whole bunch of other devices. So this can keep going on and on and on. So I chose to map this one bad device that had the 200 and odd count, because if I did the one that had 1600, that's how that mess would have looked. So needless to say, that is pretty bad. And we can see at the edges how it keeps compounding, and we could just keep doing that exercise over and over again. So it's bad. So we need to do advanced analytics to try to figure out this problem. So up to this point, everything that I've done did not require any type of fancy tools. This was all done with regular logs at the banks that your gateways are already collecting. There's nothing new here that was much fancier other than downloading the logs and using Excel to do some of this analysis. So now how do we take this game to the next level? Because we can't have analysts sitting there downloading logs every day and trying to find these mule accounts. We need to put a little bit of smarts in behind it. So the way we prefer to do things around here is the behavioral way. So again, even though we have a product, this same concept applies internally if you have the resources, if you have the technology, and you have the skill levels within the organization to follow the same recipe, which comes out to, at the bottom of this pyramid, the foundation of everything is just having good data to begin with. So are you collecting the data that's useful? Can you collect keystroke movements, mouse activities, touch screen behavior, device movement? A lot of data about how the person is using their devices. If you collect all this data, then we start, being able to put behavioral profiles together and doing a little bit of profiling, so that you can then use a machine learning to do these things. So this is the foundation to your machine learning program. So if you have people that do machine learning, the collecting the data is that foundation. Now they can do two things. They can create two profiles. So we can create a profile about the physical devices that are being used. So, how are they holding a device? How are they typing, the rhythm that they type in, how they touch a screen, how the device moves, and even signals about the device itself. Are they changing devices consistently? New devices showing up all the time. All this kind of physical profiling helps us, the networks, the IPs, everything helps us create a profile on this user against the rest of the population as well. So we can see that maybe Edgar only has, again, 2 locations or 3 known locations. So always on a particular phone carrier, because that's the phone that I use. Always on either my office network and on that computer that looks in a specific way, and on my tablets at home. So, which again, it's a consistent network. So those devices are consistent. Those networks are consistent. The way I use them are consistent, and we create a profile around that. But then we're going to combine that with some cognitive profiling as well, because the way that we use these devices also shows our, cognitive ability. So, our cognitive abilities, or the state of our mind at that point. So if somebody's coaching me to do something, I might start moving my mouse and doodling around. I am a very big fidgety person, and I start moving my mouse and doodling it around. That's a signal because somebody, when I'm go in with a purpose of I need to pay this bill and I need to get out of the house to pick up kids from school, that's very deliberate. There's no mouse doodling, but um, if I'm, being coached, if I'm being convinced and talked around, I might start doodling my mouse or start pausing or sessions taking a lot longer than they normally do. So that just shows that I'm in a different state of mind than I am normally when I'm banking. How familiar am I with my data? So am I entering things at my regular rhythm, or does it look like somebody is coaching me, or I'm reading an email or a message or going back and forth between WhatsApp in my banking app because somebody's giving me information to deal with, as opposed to a bill that came in the email or in your regular postal mail, and you're just reading it and typing away. You're going to look different. Are you copying and pasting data that you would normally be familiar with? And even if you're typing it and you're not familiar with it, because you believe that, thwarting this kind of detection by just typing it, are you typing again at the same rhythm that you would be typing if you were familiar with that data? Are you hesitating when you're doing all these things? So that creates that cognitive, that state of mind profile. And when we put those two together, now we can do predictive signals that can be used to take decisions when at any stage, I'd be daily alerts or when transactions are happening or at login or at the end of a session. We can have signals such as basic as a score, and that could be all your model just throws out as a score that says this is within the normal range of behavior or it's not, and you use that score. If you get a little bit more fancy, then you can start creating those using what we call risk factors, which are these codes that say, hey, based on this, we believe this is happening. And also just use the plain raw data points as indicators as well to make a decision. So if we do an example of this, data familiarity with personal details, we look at if they're typing personal details, let's say to open an account, we were talking about account opening earlier. This is where this comes into play a lot. Are they typing fluently? Is it a normal typing rhythm, again, within a certain population and demographic? We personally don't collect any PII, but the banks do. So if you do, and you compare of typing rhythm to the age population of that person, are they typing within that age population? Are they correcting things all the time? Because again, they're not familiar with what they're typing. The use of copy paste or even auto-filling things is a big telltale of if they're familiar with the personal details. Do we see any behavioral anomalies again with the typing patterns? They're typing some stuff, but they're copy pasting other things. And those things that they're copy pasting aren't normally things that would be copy pasted. Are they following very specific navigational patterns through your banking app or your banking site? Or even in some instances where they're deviating from what would be the normal because they are changing parameters or in the account or adding new payees and doing a lot of those, setting themselves up. So all of these navigational, are behavioral anomalies. And somebody doesn't go in normally and add, let's say, 5 new payees. That's a behavioral anomaly that might be noticed in the Mule account. Um, and again, the platform choices, again, are they using devices that are normally associated with them? Or are there too many devices being used as we saw in one account? And again, we can look at activity trends of a Mule account. Are they logging in frequently, or is it long sessions? How many payments are they doing in that session? At velocity of that payment. We all know what happens when somebody comes knocking at the door of a bank and saying, "Hey," and one of our peers at a different bank and says, "Hey, we've had a customer report fraud. Can we get the money back?" And usually the answer is the money's gone. And that velocity of payment is a signal as well. So you have the capability to monitor inbound and outbound. That right there is a very good indicator that, hey, this account's just not behaving right. Um, And then are they, sharing the account? You got these password resets happening. Again, another sign that the mule account might be going on. So if we grab all the stuff that we had in the pyramid and we just went and did something basic, which is just a score, modeling it and score, what we ended up seeing was that from all that data that we saw earlier, everybody was scoring above the 800 mark in our model, which is pretty severe. And my vast majority of that was just scoring straight up in the 900 to 1,000 range. So when you're able to compare a data model, you have a profile of all your customers. You're able to then effectively silo out those, sample of bad ones that are bad and create your profile on it. Now you're able to spot them. The machine learning will pick up those signals of differentiating of the behavior and changing between the behavior, or even for an account that from day zero, from the start was just a mule account, that account is behaving differently than, let's say, your average 25-year-old that opens up an account, just got a new job and needed a new account. That person is going to behave a lot differently than your money mule on day one. So the scores are extremely important at the bare minimum to have one, create that model with all these data points that is able to give you that score. And then where you feed that score, that's up to your system capabilities as well. So you can, have rules on your fraud management system that fires on login, or you can have a model running on the background. It just spits out a report every day that's sent to a team, and the team reviews these reports and looks at all these accounts that might be, lighting up some high scores, and do a review of them and start blocking them. Or additionally, even when you receive that call from another bank and they say, hey, our money went to this account, you say it's not there, and you put that hold or the block on the account. But one of those immediate signals that can be looked at is, hey, what is this account scoring? In case you can't do these capabilities in real time, at least you can score and be like, okay, yeah, it's high. This is not going to be a customer that we're going to call up and they're going to pick up the phone, most likely. You're going to call up, they're not going to pick up the phone, and it's because the account was just a mule account to begin with. So that number that you're calling is just a burner phone. So this is what you can be doing with these. If we look at the score a little bit deeper, just on its own, we can go back and look at those 22,000 accounts and let's see what happens with them. Like I said earlier, there's going to be some false positives in there, right? But we know that the machine learning model is pretty good, and it has been able to pick the bad from the good out pretty good. So that ends up being about 17,200 accounts that needed reviewing. So those accounts were scoring over that threshold of 800. So in a scenario where we would want to triage, this is a lot of work to do. So in a scenario to triage these accounts, then the bank can say, well, let's start from worst to and decreasing. So let's start with everybody that's scoring 1,000. And let's handle those first. Let's handle those as they are being used. So as soon as one of these accounts logs in, we can automate things so that they are just immediately blocked, or money is held from anything that has a score of 900 to 1,000 per se. So we can create all these new strategies in there to help ease how we deal with these accounts. So yep, they might be receiving money, but we're not going to allow them to until they have a little bit of a conversation with us, and that way they can just trickle their way through. So that would be a way of using that score. So we did a test of this kind of modeling with a top global bank, and monthly around 1,000 accounts alerted after opening, but before the first malicious transaction. So there is a lot of behavior that happens before you even receive the first payment. So when we're looking at it, accuracy was at 96%, which was pretty good. We knew that these were malicious. Now, 92% of those were detected earlier than by any other system that the bank had. So traditionally the AML systems or any fraud management system, or even another bank was calling in and saying, hey, this is, this account is bad. We just sent bad money there. If we look at that accuracy though, 40% were fraud related. but then 60% were just pure money laundering activities. So in the fraud related one, it's those cases where maybe, again, it's the deceived or account takeover. Banks would classify that as fraud. Whereas the money laundering ones were just straight up, these accounts were open for no other purpose than money laundering. Now, if this works, let's see, I have a little bit of an animation here. We have a tool that actually then goes out and maps these networks together. Hopefully it plays. So hopefully if it's playing, you'll see a cursor moving around. And what we do is we start linking, like I showed you earlier, all these points together, and we can start seeing with the score, red dots that indicate areas of focus and all the other interconnections to those accounts, or all the other accounts that have been connected to them. And now we can start picking and choosing where we're going to focus our efforts on. So having these models running, having these scores allows, and having all the regular data that you already have allows you to start linking all these networks together and putting together a plan of how to do this. Let's see here. So to wrap things up, two main things here. Prevention over detection. So when we did that first exercise, it was all about detection. It was all about finding, the bad stuff that already happened with those signals that we had in logs. With doing advanced analytics, now we start taking things to a prevention state. So we can start looking at when an account starts behaving differently than the regular population. So we want to take that game this year from detection to prevention. Let's prevent that account from doing anything in the first place. They might be able to open it because, again, there's scenarios where there's a real person using them. But can we prevent that account from doing, a lot of damage, before even the first payment arrives? And then doing these techniques will allow you to rapidly link different things together so that you can disrupt the syndicates that are operating these accounts. It's not a one-man show thing. It is organized syndicates that are doing these things. So being able to link that these behavioral things are happening in these similar circumstances then allows you to disrupt them and get a hold of it, and then just stop them in their tracks. So maybe they will always get away with a couple. We got no doubt of that. We know fraudsters and scammers will always evolve. They'll get 1, 2 in, but as soon as they start doing that pattern and they continue to behave that way because it worked, that's where these models again come into play, because then now you can calibrate and say, all right, this is how it's happening now. Let's look for this again. So you're able to quickly then identify those things and bring it to the end. So with that all said, that's everything I've got for you today.
So I think we have quite a number of questions from the participants. So I think we have about close to 10 questions. So because of that, probably you might take only a minute or two max for each question, because otherwise we will not be able to cover most of them. So let me start with a really good question, Edgar. So what are some trends around the money mules accounts in the APAC region? Especially, I think you covered some part of it. If you want to specifically touch upon any other area.
Yeah, I think the main trend that we're seeing right now is how fraud or scam syndicates, the people that are coming up with these creative ways of doing crime, they used to not just come up with how to do the crime, but they would also have to figure out how to get the mule accounts that they were going to send money to. And just like any other thriving business, at one point you decide to start outsourcing different things. So before, they would either create their own or go on the dark web and buy a batch of these accounts, and that's how they would, do it. That was the style. Now what we're seeing is organized syndicates that are actually spinning up operations that were, or a company per se, just for the sole purpose of money laundering. So These companies are outsourcing the whole money laundering portion to these money laundering companies, and they are the ones that have a whole operation going on, and it's pretty fascinating. They have apps that the money mules use. The money mules are kind of employees, and not so much employees, but they're more of affiliates per se. They do tasks, they do jobs, and they earn money. And that the jobs that they're doing is with their bank accounts and moving it back and forth. So they complete these missions and they earn money from those missions. So it's a very organized operation that's happening there, and we expect to see a lot more of that happening. And then on the other side of the spectrum is we see a combination of fraud happening, and then or more of a scam happening with loan apps, where people are deceived into taking these micro loans, and then there a lot of bad other stuff happens, extortions and paying these things. But not only that, there's also account takeover that happens on those victims, and then their accounts are being used to launder money as well. So those are about two of the trends that are occurring right now.
Okay, so Edgar, I think there are a number of questions from the participants. Like I'll take a couple of important ones. So, how do you detect if a login was actually using VPN or not? So, is there any technology you use to detect that?
Yeah, there are a lot of services out there. So we use two combinations. We do see the IP traffic, so we know which are major VPN service providers, and hosting providers as well. So we have models that have been trained on those, and at the same time, we augment that signal with other sources that do the same pretty much. So that it's usually that it comes down to knowing who the ISP is and having that networking information. So you're either curating it yourself or buying that off of somebody else and ingesting it into your system. For banks, usually this is part of something that you would have with your cybersecurity portion of your house. So I would encourage people to talk to the cybersecurity part of the house and ask them, hey, what do we have that distinguishes that the traffic is from a VPN than from a standard house connection.
Okay. Then, if I move to the next question, it is actually, how do you generally differentiate between different devices? So, generally, like what information you collect to do this?
We collect a fair bit amount of information. It's called device fingerprinting. I can't get into the specifics of it because it's operational operational security there. But it's every bank I think has one way or another where they've created a fingerprinting of a device, and that's how we create. We know that the device is the same device, even if they go from app to browser or let's say on the phone. So yeah, it comes down to doing device fingerprinting. That's how banks do it. That's how social media does it. That's pretty much how every other e-commerce website does it as well.
Yeah. So, in line to the same question, how you manage between, data privacy related concerns and personal data related, regulations in line to the data you collect with probably anonymously from the customers, or how you generally manage the balance between the regulations of the for data privacy and also when you try to collect data, especially to do this analysis.
So we observe all local laws for wherever we are as BioCatch as a company, but this is usually guided by the bank that hires us. So the bank is leading the way. BioCatch on a As a company, though, we do not use any PII. So, as you could have seen in the presentation, at no point did I mention a person's the traditional KYC things. So, people's names, addresses, ages, date of birth. We collect none of that. We see none of that. The bank provides us none of that either. We're purely based on data points that we're able to collect. And those data points are standard data points that are really available. Again, it's not a BioCatch thing, or it's not a bank thing. It's just an internet thing. Those are the normal ways that your apps and your phones and your browsers work. So yeah, we are guided as a company by the banks on what can and can't be done. It is ultimately the bank that sets this. Uh, we don't collect anything outside that the bank does not know of. So yeah, that's pretty much how we handle that.
Yeah. So, little bit of a long question. So it's a ask by one of the participants. So basically, how can the operations in the accounts of money mules be minimized in the banks, as banks do not have the same system in terms of screening? Does the transaction monitoring can also be a way to detect made by mules?
So transaction, if I understood the question right, transaction monitoring is ultimately the way that everybody has been doing the mule game, and you can, but again, if the transactions are happening, that means we're a little bit too late, and we want to get from that detection point back to the prevention side. So what I would be focusing on, or when I was at a bank, was if I was still at a bank, I'd be looking at how to bring that capability of collecting new data points, or sometimes the bank doesn't real or the fraud side of the bank doesn't realize that a lot of this is already being collected natively by your apps or by cybersecurity side of the house. So it's where can I tap into this data and how can I start leveraging it so that I could feed it to my fraud management system or make the case to go invest in these things, in these tools, because we just don't have the place where we can put all these signals together. So yes, you can do it with transactions, but at that point you're at the detection game. You're late. So you're now just trying to minimize how much damage. You already saw, to make the analogy, the fire is already burning. Is it just going to burn one room, or is it going to burn the entire house down? That's the difference. If you put a smoke alarm, then you can catch it a lot earlier, where when the smoke is starting somewhere. So that's how I see that.
Okay, so the next question is, while the location transaction data is under the purview of reporting entities, how do we get those behavior data like keystroke, screen timing, and etc. from the customer?
This is where your talented developers come in. So you talk to your talented programmers that are developing your apps or your banking websites, and you ask them, how can you start coding these things in, or in the case of, you hire a vendor like us that has figured this out and has the technology ready to go. But yes, it's all part of just your web development ecosystem. So it's either your app or your SDK where you build these collection points in, or your website. And like I said earlier, you'd be surprised at the amount of stuff that you already probably collect. If you go talk to cybersecurity, if you go talk to marketing, they hold a lot of data, and it might be in a data lake somewhere in the enterprise, and you can start tapping into that without having to do anything really, to the website or to the app to collect some of these data points and start leveraging them.
Okay, and can this be effectively applied at the point of onboarding? That was the question.
Oh, at the point of onboard, absolutely. So in the examples that I was giving, and even at the beginning of the Q&A where I spoke about the syndicates again operating, again, these at onboarding, we see the signals of people not being familiar with the data, the typing rhythms that they do, what they copy paste, or the devices that they're using, they just aren't the same that you see over time. So collecting those things at the onboarding portion can help. But if it's a real person, they will look the same. We see in a lot of countries where people still are just going into the bank and opening the account face to face as well, because they're a real person. So that point of origination, you're going to miss that because that's happening within the bank system, not on your app or your banking website. So it's just a big it depends. But yes, in countries like I'm based in Australia, and in Australia, it's a lot of online origination. So there, fantastic signals we get. It's actually pretty easy to spot from that angle. But when it's somebody that goes into branch or the real person doing it at origination, that becomes a lot harder. And like I mentioned earlier, we don't collect PII, so we have to do all that just based on that behavior.
Okay, so the next question is there any explicit consent required from customers before collecting and using their behavior biometric data?
Yes, absolutely. I think that again, that's a it depends question on the country and the region, and what the local laws are. And not only on that, it's also dependent on both Google and Apple when it comes to mobile devices, what they actually require banks to do as well. And again, it's not just banks, it's anybody, it's any app that's operating in their app store. So there are definitely different levels of that, and that you must consent to different things. So it just, again, it depends. And the banks, again, that's part of their privacy policies already. So you'll see that within each bank, you'll see that there's something related to this. And when you install an app, you will probably get those allow or disallow things. But again, I'll just point out that even in those scenarios where people go and say, no, I'm not going to allow this to happen, that's a signal in itself when that occurs, plus other things that are just standard collection that there's just no way of opting out of it, plus the signal of they've turned off certain permissions of collection, that becomes a signal in itself, how early that happened, and along with the other behaviors that they have. So just because you say you can't collect it, that doesn't mean you've circumvented the whole thing. That actually might be the evidence that leads us to you know decide that yes, this is not good, what's happening on this account.
Yeah. So, also, Edgar, I think I'm going to combine these two questions and ask as one. So, basically, what are the risk indicators of money mules, and any tips for detecting and preventing them proactively?
um Definitely, it's around the setting up the accounts, and again, this varies. It depends on those personas. So you have those people that maybe got conned into in a romance scam into just moving money from point A to point B. That looks a lot different than somebody that opens up an account specifically for money laundering. So the people that are opening up accounts specifically for money laundering are doing a set of steps, and you have to look at your data and when you've confirmed, you have a batch of them and you start looking at them, start noticing different patterns. So are they going in and immediately setting certain things up? Are they adding a lot of accounts early on or on early in the morning because they're setting themselves up for the rest of the day so that they can receive a batch of payments and then distribute it out through 5 accounts? Like, what are these behaviors that they're doing? They seldomly, the behavior that they do, or what you see when you look at that account and what it has done, it seldomly looks like a regular person. Even if you attempted to say behave like a normal person, and how a normal person behaves is not good enough for a mule profile, because a normal person might, I only log in and send a payment here and there, occasionally during a week, where I set everything up to auto pay. I don't go in and do 5 payments. I don't go do payments every single bloody day. So you start looking at things differently. Again, same thing with businesses. If we see that mule accounts want to open up business profiles, because then those hold a whole different behavioral and scrutiny, it's still the same thing. They are not going to behave like a regular business. So it's the advice that I have is look at a couple ones that you've known, look at the data that you currently have, and try to spot where things have happened. And if you're not logging enough information, maybe that's the first project you should do, which is what can I, not so much what can I collect, but what else is somewhere around that we haven't tapped into. I would go for that. That's a real low hanging fruit. And then start going with the what can I start collecting, or what then, or how can I budget this in so I can get it in quicker and hire somebody that can provide that kind of technology and visibility.
Okay, so this question is actually about like for the first time potential mules with no historical data who are submitting account opening application for first time, what are the behavior metrics, red flags would you recommend to collect?
Definitely the low hanging fruit is the data familiarity. Like if they are just copy pasting in things or are not familiar with the data. So if I asked you what's your zip code, you would go boom, 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 boom. Whereas the money mule might not know that, or even if they know that, hey, they're watching a copy paste, type it. The way they type it, again, it's not the same way you and I would type it. So that's a big red flag there that we go with. The a lot of the fraudsters are trying to, you know, use the VPNs or even use services that don't look like VPNs, that they look like regular houses or home internet connections. They the devices that they're using, the way they anonymize them, it's again very repeatable. So you will start again if you see you'll start seeing patterns, and this is why the you got to dump out what you knew was bad. Take a look at that, and you're going to start seeing some repeatable patterns. It's not going to be the exact same thing over and over again, but you will see repeatable patterns, and you can even start bucketing. This is one syndicate. This is a different syndicate because they all, at the end of the day, they all operate like a factory. So take a look at what's already known bad versus then look at that same time period and said, all right, between the hours of, you know, the other really big red flag sometimes is where the time of the day that they're opening them. Some of them at least for Australia, you see that since Australia is so far ahead on time, people are coming online and it's nighttime here when those accounts are being open and it becomes like late at night. So then that becomes a signal in itself that the time that these accounts are being open is not the same or is always the same. You see that there's like a shift of workers that fall between certain parameters. So that can be a red flag as well. But again, it all comes back to I can give you a couple red flags that right now that they don't actually they're good pointers, but they don't matter. It's go look at what your population looks like and then start gathering those signals from there. And if you don't have the data, then that's your first assignment is to get the data.
Okay. So, Edgar, is there any limitations in terms of the technology used? For example, certain frameworks used in mobile app development and architecture or flow and etc., which has a limitation to perform this activity.
No, I think that the biggest limitations that we see is well, two ways of no from if you're just a bank trying to implement something, it's usually the limitations that we will see a bank having is if they have a fraud management platform, how much data can that ingest? So how many transactions per second they ingest with the volume of data? Because you could collect 1,000 data points, but that fraud management system that might have the modeling capabilities within it and have the models within it might not be able to cope with that volume of data. So that's probably the bigger part because regardless of how you code your app or your website, what language you use, there is usually a method to collect whatever data it is that you seek to collect to do your profiling. So that's not the biggest issue. The probably the biggest issue is what it's a lot of data that you're going to start receiving. So what can process it is where the hindrance happens.
Okay, so do you see any downside of customer experience by including, these basically APKs or tools as part of the mobile app for detecting? So how's the hardware and the performance footprint of these by including them into the existing mobile applications?
When it comes to our specific technology, you no idea. Like people have no clue that it's running in there. There's no performance degradation. It's the the data points are just happening organically already as you're using your device. That's just nature. Like it's there. All the heavy lifting is actually happening in the cloud. So that ties into that previous question that I said, which is what's receiving the data points is the issue. So if you do it yourself in-house, do you have the ability to receive all this data, churn it, and provide a signal in real time? The optimal thing would be to have a fraud management system where this data is being received. It's no different than, you, when somebody clicks, I want, send payment, and then you're making that click, that's making a call to the server. That's when this data points are being sent. That's no different. There's no impact on that. It's once that happens is okay, hey, this person wants to send money. What am I seeing them do? What have they been doing? Have they been sitting at the screen for 4 minutes? And is that normal? The systems that are churning and making those decisions, those are the ones that are the challenge. So we process everything in cloud and use that ability to be able and that power. So we're mostly powered by Azure in the cloud, but also by Google Cloud. So that gives us that ability to do it in line and see no degradation whatsoever.
Okay. So the next question is how well can the behavior data in the model distinguish from customers with accessibility issues?
Ah, it's a fantastic question. Um, it's not going to tell me this person has an accessibility issue or what it is. But again, it's back to the behavioral things. If that person is a what we would call a vulnerable customer, um, they will behave again in a very particular way. So their profile will always be typing at a certain rhythm, or let's say in the scenario of somebody with say Parkinson's, or they will shake their phone in a particular way. Those things are going to always be there. So it's when that deviates. So let's say somebody that's a caretaker of that person decides to do something bad, and they hold that phone and they start doing a transaction, that profile is going to look different. Behavior can't be faked. So we won't know what it is, but we know that the behavior has changed. Those the 100 previous sessions do not look like the current session.
Yeah. So basically from the normal behavior, when you benchmark the normal behavior from that, anything going unusual, you take it as a red flag.
Correct. It's then it starts scoring higher, and then depending on the data points, then it's again where we start not just giving it a score, but actually saying this is the why. Typing pattern anomaly or advanced key combinations that don't usually happen for that customer are happening now. Those are all indicators that this is not the same person using that. There's never just one little thing in itself. It's the accumulation of different things where it's like, okay, go, start stepping up. That this just doesn't look like it has always been.
So the one last question to ask is again a bit of a technical one. So other than the VPN, do you able to detect the proxy or Tor browser or any other different underground uh, encrypted channels, through the application?
Yeah, and it's yes, and it's still the same answer based on a lot of data that's collected, and we profile, we know which networks are bad, and we also have services that are specifically dedicated for those purposes, and we consume those signals as well to create a really good um, profiling of that. There is another method, but that I'm not at the liberty of discussing in a public forum, unfortunately. But yes, those, if I would advise if somebody's trying to implement something like that, to just look at the commercial options out there, and those usually will catch at least the low hanging fruit, and then you start looking at how to step up your game. And again, for us, I'll be honest, it's about behavior. The VPN part is just a minor thing. Like you can figure out how to look like you're coming from a residential, which is happening due to malware. Connections are coming out of residential connections and they look real, but the rest of the behavior on the account, you can't forge that. That's just one little data point. That's a tiny, so for people, the amount of effort that criminals put into obfuscating their IP address and making it look like a particular way, it is negligible. It's just a tiny little portion of what a model does. So there's a lot more that they need to be forging to make that be worth the effort of forging. So yeah.
So I hope each and every one of you enjoyed the session and had a really good, informative and knowledgeable session for you. So thank you everyone, and thank you Mig and the team and everybody to organizing this and taking effort on this. And thank you very much for proactively joining and being part of this wonderful session we had. Thank you very much. Have a good day to you, all of you.
Thank you, Suresh. Thanks everyone for joining.